Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing one of my timed sketching exercises with you. I absolutely love working on this type of quicker, rougher, imperfect, and even unfinished drawing. And honestly, I find this practice just as valuable as more finalized, polished pieces that take lots more time. And the reason this is because through this kind of quicker exercise, we're not only continuing to develop our observational skills, our hand-eye coordination, and our mastery over our drawing medium, which we basically develop these skills via any type of drawing, but when we're working on quicker timed sketches, we're really challenging ourselves in a different way because since we only have a certain amount of time, this challenges us to get down the main information on paper as quickly as possible, which is something that we don't necessarily do and a skill that we don't necessarily develop when we have tons of hours to work on something or when we don't establish a specific time frame for ourselves. These kinds of exercises also, I feel, help me become more expressive and they help me embrace imperfection. Not to mention, if you're a super busy person trying to improve your drawing or sketching skills, you really have no excuse because you can set your timer for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, depending on your level and the complexity of what it is that you're trying to sketch. And you can get in your practice quickly with a minimal amount of supplies. Okay, so before moving into my process, and you're actually going to see me set a timer for 10 minutes on my phone, and I left the phone to the left of me as I was drawing so that you can see how it goes off at the end of those 10 minutes. But before jumping into any kind of quick sketch, I always take at least a minute or two to observe the reference photo. I always work from general and make my way towards specifics when I am drawing. I always make sure to consider everything as simple shapes or forms, and I also make sure to start my sketch very lightly so that I can refine my drawing along the way, even though in this case for this type of exercise I really try to keep the erasing to a minimum because I have to keep it moving and we're not really going for perfection here. If proportions and shapes are slightly off, that's perfectly okay for this type of sketch. I just want to communicate the main idea down on paper for this one as best as I can in the time that I have, starting first with my preliminary outline sketch and then moving on to doing any kind of quick shading that I am able to develop within the time that I have set for myself. And whatever I am able to do within the established time frame, that's what I'm able to do, and I would call it done and maybe move on to the next sketch, or if that's all the time I have for my practice during the day, then that's okay, I got my practice in. Something I always ask myself before moving forward when I am observing that reference photo is, what challenges does this particular photo or does this subject or group of subjects bring forth for me? And this is going to depend on your own strengths and weaknesses and your level. But for me, what I can tell you is these are 3 shapes or forms that are relatively similar, but they're not exactly the same. These are organic objects, natural objects, and they have imperfections and irregularities throughout them, even though their shape or their form is relatively similar. Another thing I notice is their orientation in space. They have different tilts to them, different angles. One of them is closest, another is behind that one, and we have one that is farthest away. So I have to make sure that I have overlapping shapes in my sketch. I also ask myself, where is the location of the light source in relation to these objects? I see very dark cast shadows under these pears on the surface that they are on. And these cast shadows are almost centered, maybe a little bit more to the left than to the right, but they're pretty centered beneath the pears. I also noticed the main highlights on these pears. From the location of both the cast shadows and the highlights on these pears, I get the sense that the light source is hitting these pears almost directly from above them, almost centered above these pears. This information is going to be especially helpful for me when I move on to any shading that I might be able to do during the time that I have available. So those are the main things that I make sure to observe in this reference photo before getting started. I would not recommend getting started with a timed sketch or a quicker sketch until after you've taken at least a minute to observe your reference photo. Believe me, you don't want to be making sense of these things while your time is running. I would even recommend at least establishing some sort of process for yourself, like what you're going to do first, what you're going to be doing next, and what you're going to be doing last before jumping in. I'm going to be working in my 9 by 12 inch sketchbook from Strathmore, and I'm going to be using just one single drawing pencil, and this is a 6B drawing pencil, which makes it pretty soft. The tip is relatively well sharpened. I don't like using a very sharp tip for this kind of exercise. In art school, we used to do this exercise all the time using charcoal sticks. When it comes to using graphite pencils, I like going in with a slightly blunter tip and making sure that I'm using primarily the side of the tip of the pencil, especially in the beginning phase of the sketching process where I'm laying down the shapes. Going in with the side of the tip of the pencil as opposed to the tip helps me create lighter, blurrier, fuzzier lines. The only other drawing tool I have with me is a soft graphite eraser, and I'm going to do my best not to use it at all. Okay, so right here, you just saw me set my timer for a total of 10 minutes on my cell phone, and I'm gonna place it right beside me so that the moment that it goes off, I can stop immediately. I loosened up my hand and my arm a little bit and then jumped straight in because the clock was ticking. You're gonna see me work on this sketch 100% in real time, so this is the actual speed at which I'd be moving for a 10-minute sketch. I'm working on these general largest shapes first, focusing on shape, focusing on proportion, and on the location of these different elements in relation with each other. You can see how I'm not going in and trying to create perfect shapes for these pairs right off the bat with one single stroke, but I'm actually going in with multiple lines and creating blocky looking shapes with these straighter lines. By laying down straight lines, I'm able to get down the major angles that I see there created by those shapes in that reference photo as best as I can. And then I simply connect those lines as I go. Instead of going in and focusing on creating the most perfect shape for the first pair and then move on to the next pair and then move on to the next, I'm laying down these lines quickly and observing everything as a whole. By laying down these straighter lines and focusing only on major angles and also maybe recreating the shapes created by the negative spaces in between the pairs, I'm able to get these shapes down on paper faster so that I'm able to compare these different elements with each other. Remember that getting proportions right is all about getting the relationship between the different parts making up the whole right. And the more quickly I'm able to create these various shapes on paper, the more quickly I can relate them with each other. This is a relatively similar technique to the envelope method that I have shared in other sketching videos, which I'll make sure to link to down below in the text section of this post, in case you'd like to learn more about the envelope technique, which is super helpful when you're drawing freehand. I continue drawing as lightly as possible, barely pressing down the tip of my pencil on my paper at all, as I was creating those larger shapes. This is so that if I initially lay down any lines or sections of my shapes that don't look quite right, because I am drawing so lightly, they won't be so noticeable at the end. Once I'm happier and more confident with how my shapes and overall proportions and locations of different elements is looking, then I go ahead and start pressing down a tiny bit harder. I also went over those blockier, straighter lines and turned them slightly more into curves. Now that I had those 3 blockier shapes down on paper and I liked those proportions and everything looked relatively good. Once those larger shapes were in, I then added in the stems for these different pairs, making sure that I incorporated a lot of irregularity and imperfection and that I made them different from each other. Once that was done, it was time to get started with adding in some shading because I still had some time available. So all I am doing right here is I'm starting to fill up sections inside of my pairs where I see darker midtones and darkest darks in that reference photo. I bring in the information that I noticed in that reference photo before getting started in relation to the light source and the shadows. I also bring to mind the structure, the roundness of these pears. And when it comes to shading, I keep it really simple, really minimal. I try to simplify the values that I see in that reference photo as highlight areas, mid-tone areas, and darkest areas. Simplify everything into 3 or 4 different values, perhaps the lightest value where the whiteness of the paper is left shining through, completely uncovered by any graphite. Then perhaps 1 or 2 mid-tone values where you cover up that paper with a small amount of graphite or a thin layer of graphite. And then the darkest areas where you overlap more layers of graphite or press down a tiny bit harder. I continue to keep it moving, keep it flowing, do my very best not to get stuck in any single area. And along the way, I am constantly looking at my reference photo. I'm just going in very quickly and starting to layer graphite in sections of midtones and darkest darks, making sure that the pressure that I'm exerting on my pencil and any layering that I am doing of my graphite goes hand in hand with the values that I'm able to see in that reference photo. I'm leaving white paper completely uncovered so that that brightness can stand in place for my lightest value areas. Then in lighter midtone sections, I go in with a very thin light layer of graphite. In darker midtone sections, I perhaps layer my graphite a little bit more. And in darkest dark sections, I layer my graphite a little bit more and /or go in with slightly more pressure. Though I'm really never pressing down super hard because I don't want to burnish or damage my paper. But you can see how I am laying down this graphite in a very quick, sketchy way. I'm not really trying to create any smooth transitions or anything like that. I'm just using back and forth motions. And because I am going in with the entire side of the tip of my pencil, I'm able to cover up larger sections more quickly, as opposed to using just the tip of my pencil. I've mentioned this in past drawing or sketching tutorial videos, but in realism, there are no outlines. So whenever you're looking for higher levels of realism, and I know that this is just a quick timed sketch, and I'm not really pushing for super high levels of realism with this one, but it is important to bring to mind that if you want this to look more realistic, even if it looks quite sketchy and unfinished, you want to stay away from the look of outlines. And because I made sure that in the beginning, when I was creating my preliminary outline sketch, I made sure I was going in super lightly, you can see how by this point in the process, that preliminary outline sketch is almost starting to disappear because I am working on developing all of these different value shapes, both inside of the pears and even outside of the pears. I'm making sure to only darken the edges of these pears that need to be darkened. The edges that are in shadow or that I perceive to be darker in that reference photo. And the edges of the pears that don't need to be darkened or that have to be left with a very light value because perhaps they are closer to the light source or there is some reflected light bouncing on them, I don't go in and darken, and I don't go in and create an outline around my pears just because I feel I need to separate these pears out. If you develop the different values effectively inside of the pears, there is no need to go in and deliberately create or draw an outline around your 3 pears. They will separate out visually. You will be able to tell them apart. Continue noticing those values. Continue noticing shadow sections in between your pears or where a pear is creating a shadow on another pear. Continue bringing to mind the light situation going on in this environment that these 3 pears are in, and also bring to mind the 3-dimensional structure of these pears. One important thing that I want to point out is notice how I developed a little bit of a light value around these pears, especially the one at the top and along the top edge of the one in the middle. Sometimes it's very helpful to develop a little bit of a lighter value or even a darker value around the subjects, especially when you have a section of the object or the subject that is super light in value. Because obviously, if you have a very light value, the whiteness of the paper inside of the object or subject, and you leave the whiteness of the paper just completely blank with no graphite on it outside of the subject, While those two areas can visually merge together, especially if your preliminary outline sketch is very light, which I would highly recommend, of course. So by just developing another value outside of the subject, you're creating a distinction and visually separating out those two areas. They no longer merge together. Obviously, the greater the difference between the value inside of that section of the pair and outside of that section of the pair, the more contrast that will create and the more the pair will pop. I like to push the contrast along some of the edges of the pairs wherever it makes sense with that light situation, but along other edges, that difference between the values inside of the pair and outside of the pair is quite subtle. For example, notice this section here, which has the lightest value. It's the complete white of that paper left uncovered with any graphite. And the value that I developed right above it, outside of the pair, is very, very light. So there is very little contrast, but at least there is somewhat of a distinction between what is the pair and what is the background. Whereas right here, this is a very, very dark section inside of the pair, and outside of the pair, I left the paper completely white. So this is a higher level of contrast. You want a combo of these things. Subtle change in values, more obvious change in values. And also sometimes the darker value is going to be outside, and other times the darker value is going to be inside. Somewhere around here, I feel like I'm almost done with this quick sketch, and I was wondering how much time I had left on the clock. So I turned the screen of my cell phone back on, and I noticed that I had around a minute left. And I used that time to deepen and darken my darkest value areas a little bit more in order to push that contrast a little bit more in those darkest areas. All right, so I'm almost done with this sketch, and I just want to close this video with a few final thoughts. First of all, I really hope that I encouraged you and inspired you to work on these kinds of quicker sketches. Learn the basics of drawing that I've shared before in past freehand sketching videos. I'll make sure to link to a couple of my freehand sketching videos down below in the text section of this post so that you can go and check them out if you haven't already. And perhaps don't time yourself in the beginning until you learn the concepts, the main ideas that you have to make sure to bring in, and also the overall process. And once you're ready, I would encourage you to try these out. However, I'm a huge believer in taking your learning incrementally a step at a time towards more challenging objects or subjects. And I know that timing yourself can certainly be overwhelming and can stress you out. As I said in the beginning, always bring in your current skill level and your own personal strengths and weaknesses. What I always recommend is challenging yourself incrementally. So the task on hand should be a little bit challenging, maybe should make you a little bit nervous, but it should be doable for your current skill level. And start with one single object, and an object that is somewhat familiar to you and maybe is simpler for you, that you're more comfortable drawing. Then maybe bring in another object, then another object, then bring in objects that are slightly more complex. And also something that you can change as you go, depending on the number of objects that you're thinking of sketching and their complexity, is the time that you set. Sometimes I set my timer for 15 minutes if it's a subject I've never drawn before and I feel that I need a little bit more time. Sometimes I set it for 13 minutes, sometimes 10, sometimes 8, sometimes 5, sometimes 3, and sometimes 1. It completely depends, but I promise that you're going to get a lot out of this exercise, whatever kind of subject or object it is that you choose and whatever time it is that you set for yourself. And what's super, super cool is that if you do these sketches consistently, you're going to see a lot of improvement in a short period of time. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.